Alrighty, why don't we get started? How are you guys doing today? Good MAGFest thus far? So my name is Austin Dress, and I'm doing the MAGFest Ocarina Panel for 2022. And I'm an independent maker at Savage Ocarinas here in Maryland. So today, what I was really expecting was to have a lot of the members from Acabanda. I don't know if some of you have been to, I guess, the 2019 MAGFest. They were up on the main stage performing. And so today we were supposed to have several of them, including myself, presenting the Ocarina panel, doing some live performances. And just because of things that you probably already know, not everybody could make it. So I decided that I would continue to put this on for you guys. Definitely look them up if you're not familiar with them. They're an amazing group of musicians, and especially David Eric Ramos, which some of you may have seen on YouTube. He provided a lot of the content for me today for this presentation. So definitely please support them. So who am I? So like I said, so I'm an independent maker at Savage Ocarinas. So I actually live in the historic Savage Mill area, which is kind of what I derived my company from. I've been doing this, I think, seriously for about 4 years now, 4 or 5 years. Got my first kiln in 2018 and decided to take ocarina making really seriously. And then there's a few makers down there that have really influenced some of my work. So today what I plan to go over is a lot of maybe some content that you've seen before if you've been to these panels on ocarina history. But I'd also like to talk about ocarina making. When I first got into playing, it was one of the things I wondered is like, how are these things made? How do they work? And so I'm excited to share some of that with you guys here today. Here's some pictures of my work. So I particularly like to do raku-fired ocarinas, which you can see on the bottom, and also pit-fired. These are very chaotic, random processes that give you these very unique and stunning colors. And then just so you know, if you don't have a ticket, so at the end of this presentation, I'm going to be giving out 2 ocarinas that I made where I embellished MAGFest on it on the side, and I made these a few days ago and actually recorded some of that so you get to see some of the making process. So if you haven't got a ticket yet, please talk to my wife in the back. So what is an ocarina? An ocarina is an aerophone. It's a category of instrument, which basically means it uses vibrating mass of air to produce sound. It's also been called a globular flute or a vessel flute. So typically when you think of a standard flute, it's a piped instrument where really the length of the pipe determines the frequency of the note that you're making. An ocarina is globular, and so really what determines the fundamental frequency of the instrument is the volume of it. And as a result, the hole positions on the instrument don't necessarily matter as much as they would on a flute. Ocarinas are made out of a variety of materials: clay, wood, plastic, metals. I've even seen some made out of different kinds of stone. Ocarina literally means little goose in Italian. I guess there's some resemblance there. I'm not really quite sure where that came from, but that's what it means. So how does an ocarina work? So on the bottom here, I have a cross section of a cavity. So there's a windway where you blow into the instrument. There's a sound hole or a window where the air basically splits across, and then a chamber. And so essentially what happens as you blow into the instrument, air internal to the chamber starts to compress. And due to the springiness of the air, it will then actually go from a high compression to a low compression. And so if you were to actually look at a fluid dynamics model of the ocarina as you're blowing through it, you would see these pressure changes of where it's going into negative and positive pressure very rapidly. Ocarinas have holes on them, which allow you to basically increase the frequency of the note that you're playing. And as a result, the air oscillation that's going in and out of the ocarina is happening much faster as you go up the scale. There's an equation here which kind of describes what an ocarina is. In a general sense, it's a Helmholtz resonator. Predominantly the main things that you're concerned with, again, are the volume of the instrument and the cross-section and area of the sound hole. That predominantly determines the fundamental frequency of the instrument. And obviously, like I said before, it goes up as you add additional tone holes. So ocarina history. So one of the things that I've observed is since the dawn of time of human beings playing around with clay, they've been trying to make instruments and especially different kinds of whistles. I mean, you'll see all sorts of, simple whistles to more complex things. Ocarinas are believed to have dated back to over 12,000 years ago. And in particular, there's a rich history in China of these zuns. So they're very similar to an ocarina. The only difference is you have this hole on the top that you blow across versus having a windway that's directing your airstream into the instrument. One of the oldest known ocarinas is the runic ocarina, oldest in Europe is the runic ocarina in Kosovo from 6500 to 3500 BC. And it seems that ocarinas have been reintroduced to Europe and different parts of the world throughout history. So for example, when the Spanish explorers or conquistadors were down in Mesoamerica, the Aztecs and the Mayans were making these types of flutes, which influenced Spain and different cultures around Europe in the 1500s. So the modern ocarina, which probably most of you are all familiar with, was invented by Giuseppe Donati in Budrio, Italy. So he invented the modern transverse ocarina in 1853 at the age of 17. So up to that point, ocarinas really had just been toys. A lot of them were not very well tuned. They could make sound, but he really kind of took it to the next level and treated it as a series of instruments. And to this day in Budrio, there are biennial ocarina festivals held there. You can go and see the museum where they have a lot of his tools that he used to make some of these original transverse ocarinas. So after that, Giuseppe Donati he's famous for inventing the 10-hole ocarina. But in 1948, it was innovated again by Takashi Atagawa, who invented the modern 12-hole. And this is pretty much the most common ocarina that you're going to see today if you're looking online. And they're pretty much all throughout the world. And they're much more challenging to make. Basically, as you increase the number of holes in the ocarina, you have to supply more breath pressure. And what ends up happening is on the upper end, the notes can get much, much airier. And so to make a ocarina that has a pure tone throughout the entire range, it takes a great amount of skill to size the chamber and make the sound hole. So in 1986, Nomuro Sojiro produced music for the NHK program, The Great Yellow River. And this was widely listened to all over Japan. Now, Sojiro started making his ocarinas in 1975, and for 10 years, he developed over 10,000 ocarinas. And he's said to have basically selected 10 odd ocarinas that he basically used to perform today. And I actually have a clip here of this performance. This is the Great Yellow River theme. So, I mean, you can see why that kind of left a lasting impression on people. I mean, I've seen a lot of that album played with backdrops of nature, and that was something that Nomuro Sojiro really appreciated. I mean, I think he was working on a desk job for many years and became an ocarina maker and decided to live in the mountains and make, being an ocarina maker his full-time job. So as a result of this, like I said, this had a huge influence on media, especially in Japan. And of course, as you know, it was promptly featured in the Legend of Zelda: Ocarina of Time. And so it's interesting is, the first game that introduced the ocarina, at least in Legend of Zelda, was A Link to the Past, and this was 5 years after Sojiro had made his performance. All right, so next I'm going to go over different kinds of ocarina types. When you actually talk about what is an ocarina, it turns out there are many different kinds. People call them all the same thing, but there's different fingering systems and styles, so I'm going to go over some of those. So the first one is our ocarina pendants. So these were developed in 1936 by an English mathematician named John Taylor. So typically these ocarinas have anywhere from 4 to 6 holes, and they don't use a linear fingering system like the transverse. So on a transverse fingering system, you're basically lifting up your fingers one at a time in a straight line. So a pendant ocarina actually relies on combinations of different open finger holes to create larger openings or total cross-sectional area of the finger holes to play higher notes. So they tend to be a little bit trickier to play. As I said earlier, so Giuseppe Donati, he invented the transverse ocarina, and I kind of just went through what the difference between that and the pendant. And pictured here is a Pacchioni ocarina. And so this Horio Pacchioni is a Italian maker. He recently retired, but his work was featured a lot in Pedrillo. So the inline ocarinas, they were developed in the 1980s, and they basically use the same fingering system as a transverse ocarina, but they basically just like rotate it so that it's in a straight line. So then there are multi-chambered ocarinas. So the idea of these is to extend the range of a single chambered ocarina by adding multiple chambers to it. So these two focal length Stein ocarinas here, you can see that there's a set of finger holes, kind of like what I was showing for here, but then you can basically slide your hand down to play a second chamber, and they have basically two different wind ways. And in addition to double chambers, or even triple and quadruple, and so depending on the song you're trying to play, you may want one of these. Personally, for me, especially in the alto range, I prefer to just play double ocarinas because the tones can get very, very loud. Another type of multi-chamber ocarina is a harmony ocarina. So these are similar to the multi-chambers that I've just described, but instead of trying to basically maximize the extent of the range that you have on the instrument, the goal is to create chords or harmonies by playing different intervals. So pictured here is an Alan Albright ocarina, and I actually have one here. I will try to play it for you. They're very difficult to play. So on the first chamber, it's tuned to the key of F, and on the second chamber, it's tuned to the key of C, so that's a fifth apart. And so you can play them where you're playing on one and just using the other as a drone. Or you can kind of play them where you're extending the range by using both. But in general, they're meant to be played as harmony ocarinas. All right, so this is, if you've been to one of these panels before, you may have seen this. This is a category of its own, and I'm not sure if David actually wants me to credit this slide to him that I took from his presentation, but. If you go on the internet, you're going to see lots of ocarinas that look like this. They're very cheap. I think they're pretty much they're made in China, and I mean honestly, they look very nice, but they're just really not well tuned. And part of this is is that when they make them, they basically have a set size of drills that they're drilling the holes in, and they're not spending a lot of time to check and make sure that those tone holes are sized correctly. So. They can range anywhere from around $10 to $13. If you have one of these, I'm sorry, But if you're looking for one, again, they're nice. They're kind of a novelty, but I really would not recommend them as a starting instrument. And so at the end of this, I'll kind of talk about, if you are interested in getting the ocarina, good ocarinas to start with. So the last thing I'll talk about with regard to ocarinas is ocarina sizes. So thus far we've talked about the many different types of ocarinas, but especially in Italy, they would make ocarinas in many different sizes, and some of the most common keys are bass C, alto G, alto C. Alto C is probably the most common one that you'll see out there. Soprano G and soprano C. And so the reason they did this is that in the Italian style, they often have players playing in a septet, a group of 7 people. And they all play ocarinas at different sizes to produce a melody. And so here I have some examples. So this on the left here is the, I'm going to try to pronounce this, but well, I guess it's the ocarina group of Budris. So this has professional, well, all of them are very talented, but particular there's a gentleman named Fabio playing here. And then I had to include this. So yeah, so in 2019, Acabanda did a presentation, or played on the main stage. So I have a short clip of them. So that's what basically an ocarina septet sounds like. So I guess in the second half of this presentation, I'm going to talk about ocarina making. As I said, this is something that I was really interested in when I first got into playing ocarinas. And so I'm going to share some of that with you guys today. So as I described earlier, there's the Helmholtz equation for describing how an ocarina behaves. But like most things in the world, right? We can talk about mathematically what a sphere is, but they don't necessarily exist in the real world. And so when it comes to making something like an instrument, taking that equation and mapping it to have a high level of precision and using that theory to a real world instrument is kind of challenging. And so what it takes is a lot of iteration. And it combines a lot of knowledge of several disciplines, mainly music and material sciences, whether that's ceramic, wood, or metal. And it's a very iterative process. So typically when you want to make an ocarina, you start out with a goal for the fundamental key that you want to make. So I want to make this ocarina in the key of C or G or whatever it may be. And so using that information, you can basically try to size the ocarina as close as you possibly can to what you want, and also the sound hole. So you make the ocarina, and then you fire it, and then you play and see where the pitch is located. And generally that's not going to be right the first time. So you go through a process of making these forms, making a mold, adjusting the size and volume of the chamber, and again, accounting for the shrinkage in the kiln. So even though you may say, okay, I know that the size of my chamber needs to be so big, when I'm playing it prior to firing it in a kiln, the ocarina is going to shrink anywhere from 7 to 10%. So what does this look like? Well, once you've actually developed a mold that you can work with, you can the process gets a little bit simpler. So picture here, you start with some clay. You're basically going to compress this down, and you're going to then push it into your mold. And then I use a template to basically outline the area of the the ocarina that I want to basically remove clay from. And over the years, at least for me, the best way I've found to estimate the internal volume of the chamber of the ocarina is to weigh the clay. You'll see some makers, they'll basically roll out slabs of clay like a pizza, and they'll push it in the mold, or even they'll basically do slip casting, which is where you have a very liquidy form of the clay. You pour it into a mold, and then you let it dry for a certain amount of time, and that amount of time will affect how thick the walls are. So, I think especially for methods where you're pressing in the clay, there are some drawbacks in that it's more challenging to like estimate the volume. So at this stage here on the bottom right, I've pushed the clay in. I've carved out roughly 150 grams of clay because I'm trying to make an Alto C ocarina. And the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to use a sound hole tool and a slot stick to basically make the windway and the and the sound and the tone hole. I've made these before out of wood and plastic, and what I do now is I 3D print them, and it allows me to very quickly vary the scale and make all different kinds of sizes of ocarinas. Typically, one of the most important things is when you're making an ocarina, when the clay is initially wet, so right after you've pushed it into that mold and you pop it out, the clay is still very wet. And what you're trying to make for the sound hole is you want a very sharp blade. And in order to do that, you actually just have to wait. You just, after I take it out of the mold, I'll let it sit in a container for a day to get a little bit drier so I can sharpen that with a razor blade. So after making the sound hole, I'll drill the different tone holes. So the sizes for those are kind of determined through just process of iterating and taking notes. Generally, I don't have to make much change now that I understand like what is the size of the chamber, and where I'm going to place those holes. I guess the last thing here is so the alignment of the sound hole edge, that blade I was describing with the windway, is very important. And so what ends up happening is when you look through an ocarina through the windway, you kind of want to see an edge, kind of like this diagram I have here, where the dark blue is basically the edge of the clay that you're looking at that's splitting the air, and then the top is basically light, as open space. And so you want that to be as flat, straight, and uniform as possible. So tuning ocarinas. So basically, the way this works is you've made your ocarina. It's pitched to a specific key that you want. The way that you open up the finger holes is ordered, and so I've showed an example here. This is the linear fingering system. So the main things to know is that the larger the tone hole, the larger the pitch you're going to get. So to give an example, let's say I'm blowing an instrument and I'm playing it, and I play C. And then I want to basically lift up my pinky finger to play D. Well, how do I know how large to make that hole? So typically what you do is you keep your breath constant and then lift up your finger. And when you look at the tuner, you'll have one in front of you, you'll see that likely the note that you're playing is slightly flat. And generally you want this to happen. So you want basically each note, one after each other, to be like roughly 5 to 25 cents flat in between those notes when you're playing with a constant breath pressure. And this is because in order for the ocarina to play stably, as you go up the scale, you have to supply more and more breath pressure. And this is kind of a thing, if you have an ocarina, I'd encourage you to do whenever you get a new one, is look at it with a tuner. If the maker says, hey, this is pitched to the key of C, to basically look and see what is the breath pressure that the maker intended for playing that instrument. I have, I guess there's another cartoon diagram down here. So in addition just to drilling in holes straight, another way to basically increase the pitch without increasing the size of the holes is to undercut. So it's basically like you're taking a blade in the hole and carving out like around the side, and that has the effect of basically increasing the pitch while keeping the finger holes the same size. So after you've made your ocarinas, you let them dry. So I either burnish or apply a thin slip called terra sigillata. And this basically makes the surface very shiny. And this is primarily used for when you're doing pit firing. Ocarinas are fired, at least mine, I fire at Kono 8, which is 1728 degrees Fahrenheit. And you can kind of see there. So once you get over about 1,000 degrees, everything is going to be glowing, essentially. So that heat is basically entering into the visible spectrum of light. This is what they look like after they've been fired. And so at this point, what most people do is they'll either put like shellac on them to make them shiny or a wax. They may glaze them in a traditional glaze like you see for a mug or other kinds of pottery ware. What I'm going to talk about is the two techniques that I like to do because I think they're very exciting, which is pit firing and raku. So for raku, so you would basically glaze the ocarina similar to how you would if you were just doing normally glazing it. But this is a process of basically rapidly heating up the piece. So normally when we fire ware, it takes about anywhere from 7 to 12 hours to fire that piece and cool down. And when you're glazing it, it's similar. It takes a long period of time. So raku says, all right, let's just do this as fast as possible. We're going to throw glaze on it. We're going to heat it up to 1800 degrees in 45 minutes, and then we're going to pull it out while it's hot and put it in a bin of combustibles. And that has a result of creating these very unique glaze effects. And so as you can imagine, that thermal shock can really affect the piece and potentially break it. So you have to typically use special kind of clay for this. So this is what it looks like when it's firing in a gas raku kiln. I think at this point, the glaze is actually melted because it's shiny. And on the right here, this is actually some of the ocarinas I'll be giving away today, pulling them outside of the kiln and then putting them in these bins of combustibles and covering them. So what I have in there is basically hamster pet bedding. You can really use anything. But again, that piece is like over 1,000 degrees. So just it coming into contact with that material immediately makes it combust. And so what I'm hoping to happen here is as it's getting exposed to the air, the glaze is actually going to form these very tiny cracks in them. And so what I'm doing here is I'm batting it with the trash can lid to basically get more air on it to try to get it to crack a little bit more. And then you cover it. And so what ends up happening is here, when you cover it, right, that piece is still extremely hot. And so when you have basically a lot of heat and you have fuel and you have oxygen, you have fire, right? So in this case, we have heat from the piece. We have fuel from the material that's in there, but I just put the lid on, right? So there's no oxygen. Well, it actually turns out there's oxygen in the clay itself. And so what ends up happening is all this smoke that gets generated gets pulled into the piece where there's all those cracks, and it causes them to become black. And so this is what it looks like when you're done. So this is a turquoise crackle glaze and a clear crackle raku glaze. The next firing technique I'm going to be talking about is pit firing. So this is similar. You know, I would bisque the pieces, and typically pit firing is actually done in a pit. You dig a hole in the ground. I do it in a barrel that I cut in half because I find the cleanup to be easier. I put pet bedding in again. I put the pieces in with combustibles. I have some copper carbonate in there, which will produce red colors when it burns into the piece. You stack it with firewood, and then you light it on fire. And then you let it burn down to the ground. And roughly that takes about 6 hours for it to cool. And then when you're done, you can get these really unique colorings on the pieces. So on the right here, a lot of the red is from the copper carbonate, that the green material that I was burning. On the left here, I actually used it's basically a copper mesh wire that you can buy from Home Depot. I think it's meant for catching rodents. But basically, when it burns up against the piece, it creates this pattern. And if you're interested in making ocarinas, there are a lot of resources out there. I think the best one that is out there right now is The Art of Ocarina Making by Robert Hickman. I think there are a couple other books out there, but I think this is really the one that has like the most detail on it. In addition, there are a lot of resources on YouTube. There's an Ocarina Making Facebook group now, so feel free to join that. And there's also a lot of good tutorials on the Ocarina Network forum. I don't know if some of you have been on there before. But. All right, so for starter ocarinas, I guess who here has an ocarina? All right, there's a good number of you. So yeah, definitely, like I said earlier, avoid the ocarina of crap. If you want a good ocarina that you don't have to worry about it's going to break, that's not ceramic. On Amazon, you can get the Night by Noble plastic ocarina. It's very good. It's cheap. In addition, Songbird also offers some very good ocarinas. Oh yeah, okay, yeah, you have one right there. Yeah, no, I mean they're great. Yeah, a ceramic, I guarantee you drop it from waist height and it's gonna shatter. Like it's like a mug, but you love it a lot more. Right. So yeah, there's low monetary investment, and they're really have good tones, and there's low risk of breaking. In terms of the ceramic reputable makers that I would recommend, if you would like to get a ceramic, or maybe you've got a plastic and you moved on, Spencer Ocarinas. To be honest with you, so there's a lot of people who make Ocarina of Time replicas out there. This one right here, I think, is literally the best out there in terms of how well it plays and how much it looks like the real instrument. He's an incredible maker. Pure Ocarinas, Songbird, which I mentioned already with the plastic, and then also Takashi Ocarina. All right, and if you're not already, so we have a Facebook group online called the Global Ocarina Community. So if you're interested in learning about ocarinas, seeing ocarina videos, getting tips on playing, please join. Any questions? Yeah, so it's purely visual. Yeah, so I mean, a lot of times in pottery, you don't actually want your glaze to crack, but here I'm intentionally doing that. So it basically opens up a small space in between the glaze and the clay body underneath, and then the smoke gets pulled into that, creating these strong lines here. Right here. Yeah, no, I'm probably like a lot of you guys. I played Ocarina of Time. I saw a lot of the ads in Nintendo Power for these small instruments, and really it was through seeing David Ramos's videos on YouTube that I got into the Ocarina community, and then eventually started making them. So I guess was there a question over here? That's a really good question. So I have not really observed much difference. I think there are some differences between, like, if you have a more like rectangular shape. Like in the beginning, I kind of said that the shape doesn't matter. It's not entirely true. It's mainly on like certain kinds of edge cases you can get it to behave differently. But I don't know. People claim that the material can affect it. I really don't detect much difference. I think there are advantages to certain materials, like out of clay, and maybe even plastic. Well, maybe mostly clay and wood. you really have to have a some thickness to the walls of the chamber, whereas with metal and plastic, you can probably make that like super, super thin and still be strong. And what that allows you to do is make the holes smaller. Yeah. Yep. You mean for? Oh, it just kind of has to do with like the structure of it when you're the strength of it when you're working with it, right? So if I roll a really tiny thin sheet of clay and then I try to like make a shape, it's going to fall apart in my hands. Whereas metal, you can bend, or plastic, maybe you can just pour it into a mold and it can be super thin, and then when it dries, it gets very strong. So, over here. So slip casting ocarinas or any kind of pottery is a perfectly good method. The reason I'm not as big a fan of it is you have to keep around large jugs of like basically liquid clay. So like the clay bags I have, clay tends to come in 25-pound bags, which is roughly about like this big. If you're storing it as a liquid, it takes up a lot more space. The advantage of slip casting are it allows you to get a very uniform wall thickness, and that's directly related to when you pour it in, how long you wait to let it kind of dry. The thicker the walls will get, and that amount of time you wait affects basically the internal volume, and that's how ocarina maker, like particularly songbird ocarinas, that's how they make their ocarinas. So yeah, it's definitely a valid method. It's just one I don't have time for. Because of the scale that I'm doing things. Right here. Crazy requests. I don't know. I can't really speak for myself. I'm definitely a much newer maker, and I've been focused, really on developing them, and I've sold a handful at this point, I'd say. One of my friends, Caroline in Canada, she definitely does a lot of really sculptural pieces. So she'll make ones that have like dragons on them, like a ocarina that has smog on it, or like a kraken on it. I've seen her do some interesting things like that. So if you're interested in really unique sculptural pieces, I'd go see Ocarina Caro on Etsy. Any more? Rare. I mean, people ask me to play Zelda songs all the time. Recently, so part of the way I got connected with this group is I've been working with Stephen Higby of Akabanda. So he's offering lessons for ocarina. So I've been trying to build my skills more with playing. They're definitely making and playing they're related, but they're very two different disciplines. So, all right, raffle time. All right, so Becky, how many did we hand out? It's just the exterior. So, I mean, I think technically you could. I mean, you could dip it into glaze, but I mean, you generally especially around the voicing, you would want to still keep that kind of fairly clean. So that's I don't know. To me, I view it as it's adding weight. Like one of the things that I've been thinking about more as of making is like, how do you make the ocarina as ergonomic as possible? And one of the things that kind of makes any bad design is adding more weight to it. Yeah, I mean, I definitely like before joining the two halves, I'll smooth out the inside. And so I'm not going to, like, when I say here that like the material doesn't matter, that's just kind of generally my observation. I've read a lot of research papers on Helmholtz resonators. You know, I mean, most of these people are concerned with like mufflers for car engines and dampening sound. I see that the material definitely it can affect things. It's just that at least what I'm doing, I can't really detect it. All right, so we're at 100, Becky. All right. All right. Anybody got 99? All right. All right, I have them up here, so feel free to come on up. All right, we'll do the next one. 51. Yay. All right. Well, I think that's all I have for today. If there's no other questions, I really appreciate you guys coming. So.